Now, quickly before I get into the video, if you could drop a like on the video right now and subscribe to the channel, that would be greatly appreciated. No one wants to talk about the San Antonio Spurs, so I'm going to be the person to do that. And I think this team's looking pretty nice. What they've got going for them is defense. They've got a lot of defense, and more defense, because that team is stacked with perimeter defenders, and we're going to talk about that. But let's start with what they did towards the end of the season, because that's what got me excited, and that's what initially got me to make a video a few months ago about how this team's looking nice. And since the draft and since a few things have happened, I think this team looks even nicer and looks even better defensively, and the pieces are just looking really nice. So that's why I thought I'd make another video. And in the bubble, just to recap, they went 5-2 before the last game, where they sat pretty much half of their starters, and they lost in that game, but I mean, it didn't really count. So they went 5-2, incredibly impressive for a young team without who some people would consider their best player, LaMarcus Aldridge. He missed the whole bubble, and they went 5-2 against playoff caliber teams, which would have surprised a lot of people, considering this Spurs team really had no expectations heading into the bubble. A lot of people didn't even really want them there. They were like, what's this team going to do? They're just boring, they're old. Well, they were anything but, because they had all their young players playing, and that suggests that heading into next year, they're definitely not going to be a pushover, and any team coached by Greg Popovich isn't going to be a pushover, particularly when you've got guys like DeMar DeRozan, LaMarcus Aldridge, Patty Mills, and all their young players still coming through. Like, it's still a solid team. Whether they're going to make the playoffs or not, I don't think that really matters. But what I saw was the most notable difference in the bubble was their change of pace. During the regular season, particularly with LaMarcus Aldridge on the floor, they're a slow team getting up the floor. When he was off the floor during the regular season, they were closer towards the top. But in the bubble, without him and with all these young guys, a three-guard attack with DeRozan at the 4 led to them being the third fastest team in the NBA during the bubble, just behind the Bucks and Rockets. And this clearly worked, because they were getting it out in transition, they were pushing the pace, and it was clearly leading to wins, as the 5-2 record suggested. So if they can head into next year with more of this kind of ideology, then who's to say this team can't be around to the playoff picture, even in a stacked Western Conference? And even if they're not around to the playoff picture, I mean, it doesn't really matter at all, because what we're most impressed with is their young players, and I'm going to talk about that. Now, there's this notion that the Spurs don't really have that kind of strong young core that we see with the Pelicans, the Nuggets, even the Grizzlies, all these kind of teams that everyone wants to talk about, the Celtics, the list goes on and on. Now, there's this notion that the Spurs don't really have that kind of core. And it's somewhat true, because they don't have a superstar yet. It's yet to be seen if they have a superstar player like all these other teams do. But that's what happens when you don't have a top 10 draft pick for so long. What they do have is a number of players that are at the very least going to be role players, potentially all-star level players, or at the very least can be role players, starters, good defenders, who can all shoot the ball, who can play multiple positions, who can do multiple things, playmate, get to the rim, shoot the ball, as I've said, defend multiple positions. And that might be more important than getting that superstar just of now, and then potentially going forward, maybe they get that superstar in the next draft, who knows? Maybe it comes through, maybe it's Lonnie Walker, we don't know that yet. But what we do know is they've got a host of players that are all very capable players, and I think that's more important than just having one really impressive rookie. They've got a number of guys that I know are all going to turn out to be, at the very least, good role players. And let's talk about these guys, and let's start with what they did in the bubble, because that was the most recent thing we saw of them. Keldon Johnson, 3 out of his 8 games, he scored 20 points or more. He shot lights out, like 65% from 3. He showed he could make a huge impact as a scorer, and that's something they need. You then had Lonnie Walker, who 5 out of his 8 games, he scored 12 or more points. His defense still has a way to come, and he shows signs of being a really good defender, and then other times he just looks lost out there. But overall, he was shooting the ball a lot better just throughout the second half of the season, shooting 43% from 3 over the second half of the season on around 3 attempts a game. And he maintained that in the bubble. As I said, 5 out of his 8 games, he scored more than 12 points. He had multiple games with multiple assists, and just showed a lot of things that the Spurs would have been happy with. You then had Derek White, who we kind of already know about. We know what he provides. We saw him in the Nuggets series where he really exploded and made a name for himself. He just kind of stagnated in the playoffs when we expected him to take another step. And then heading into the bubble, after he had a bit more time off, a bit more time to recuperate, he came in and then averaged like 20 points a game. He was shooting lights out. He was just playing fantastically as a 2-guard alongside Dejounte Murray, and that looks like his position going forward because it just worked, and he was great in that position. And that's really promising for San Antonio fans who didn't really see the progress we expected to see him make in that next year. So to see him make that in the bubble suggests he might be able to do that going forward into next year. And then you had Dejounte Murray, who was solid as we expected. Had one game where he scored under double digits the whole bubble. He was playmaking, he was defending as he usually does, and he was just solid as you'd expect. We still want to see a bit more progression from him heading into next year, but obviously he's coming off an ACL. There's still a few things that he needs to get back to doing. But you add all of these players who are at the very least solid role players with upside to be even more, and then you add a very good draft. One of the best drafts. There was a lot of teams that had a good draft. And I mean, it's kind of weird to say because you don't really know until obviously the players have played. But just based off college and based off where they were selected, you had Devin Vassell, who some people thought could go as high as like top 5 as a top 5 flyer, given what he does as a 3-and-D player. Someone that can shoot lights out. Someone that's one of the best defenders in the league. Adds another great defender alongside Murray and those other guys. And someone that also a lot of people think can be more than just a 3-point shooter, because when he actually got the opportunity to operate as a primary ball handler, as a scorer, he dominated for Florida State. It's just a fact that their players often don't really score 30 points a game because of how their offense runs. But I think one game he had like 20 or more points in a second half alone, and that showed his ability to just score, put the ball on the floor and score. So he's not just a 3-point shooter, which some people have pigeonholed him into being, but at the very least, he's a good 3-point shooter and a good defender, so that's something, and then he's got more upside to be more than that. Maybe he's the star player that they're looking for. And then with a 41st pick in the second round to get Trey Jones, who does a number of things. He's going to come off the bench, kind of like a Patty Mills role. You could expect him to play as a 6-man. He's a great shooter off the catch, which is important because early on, he's not going to be taking a lot of shots off the dribble. He's going to be coming off screens, taking 3-point shots when they come to him, and he's good at doing that, one of the best in college basketball. He's also a great playmaker, which is important. I stress that playmaking off the bench is really important. We've seen our partnership like Lou Williams and Montrezl Harrell can thrive with a pick-and-roll guy like Lou Will and a pick-and-roll guy like Montrezl Harrell. So to have potentially Trey Jones and Jakob Poeltl off the bench could be that same kind of partnership. Obviously not there yet, but if you could see that kind of partnership thrive, that would be important. He's also one of the best defenders in the class. Again, like Devin Vassell, obviously not as versatile because he's not as tall, but in terms of guard defenders, there's not really many better. In terms of point guard defenders, in terms of someone with a really high off-ball IQ, someone who can get into passing lanes, someone who can disrupt on-ball and off-ball, one of the best defenders in the class, and another great defender to add to their ranks. Coming off the bench, Trey Jones with the 41st pick, someone who's played a couple of years in college, who's productive as a scorer, as a playmaker, a good defender. It's hard to see how this pick is anything but solid. With all this being said, I still think that the starting lineup at the moment is going to feature DeMar DeRozan and LaMarcus Aldridge until we see them either regress or traded, which would be ideal. In my opinion, the ideal scenario would be they start the season with a lineup of Murray, White, DeRozan, Aldridge, and Lyles at the 5 to stretch the floor. And then what they do is hopefully DeRozan and Aldridge perform enough and a team's desperate enough where they trade for him. And then they get picks or valuable young players or anything really, an expiring contract and a good young player. And then what they do is hopefully they lose a decent amount of games where they can get like a top 5 pick, which they haven't had since before I was born, I'm pretty sure. So they can get a top 5 pick. And even if they win like 25 to 30 games, that could still put them in contention for a top 5 pick, because you're looking at a season where about 24 teams are looking to compete. So the Spurs could be solid without having to be terrible and still get a top 5 pick, which would be important because, like I've said, they've got a number of good role players at the moment, and some of these guys might develop into the stars that they need. But in a stacked draft class, if there was ever a year for the Spurs to bottom out and have a terrible year, this is the year, because they've got the solid pieces around them. They just need the franchise piece, and there's a lot of those guys going around to next year's draft class. According to the experts, one of the best draft class in years, and apparently about 8 of these guys would have gone top 1 this year's draft. That's the kind of draft we're working with. So if you can start DeRozan and Aldridge and get enough production out of them to the point that teams are interested in trading for them, that would be important, because what that does is it gives them a chance to get a top draft pick in next year's draft, because you're likely going to be towards the bottom of the Western Conference, and with a lot of teams looking to compete, that's pretty much ideal for them to get production out of Aldridge and DeRozan at the start of the year and then look to offload them. I mean, if they could offload them beforehand, that would be cool, but it doesn't look like happening. So you're going to hope that a desperate team gets desperate, but that's what's going to have to happen, and that's why the starting lineup's likely to include both of those guys unless players just absolutely take off like Lonnie Walker, like Keldon Johnson, to the point where their starting spot just can't be denied. Yeah, I really like what I'm seeing from San Antonio, and I think a lot of people are sleeping on this young core. They don't have the superstar players or the players putting up 30 a night as young players, but what they've got is about 6, 7, half a dozen really good young players. They're at the very least going to be role players, potentially more. All can shoot, all can defend. Some of them can play make, some of them can play multiple positions. Versatility in a number of ways is what's really important in the modern NBA, and this team has a lot of that. So that's something that you shouldn't sleep on with San Antonio heading into next year. They probably won't be in the playoff picture. I hope they're not, for their sake. I think they should get a top draft pick. They've earned it. If there's a team that's earned the right to tank, which I don't think they're going to do, they're not going to be terrible. But if there's a team that's earned the right to win 15 games, it's definitely the Spurs after 22 years in the playoffs. Yeah, they've earned the right to bottom out and get a top draft pick, which I hope they get for their sake. Now, if you did make it to the end of the video, a like would be greatly appreciated. It really does help out a lot. Also, subbing to the channel would help. Other than that, I'll catch you next time. Bye.